In the first web video, we discussed the software required to make a website. In the second web video, we discussed the hardware required to make a website. But in the third web video, the subject of web hosting was mentioned. Creating a website is only part of the challenge. For others to access your website, you have to put it somewhere. But where? That's a tough question, because if you answer it wrong, you could create a lot of problems for your website. So, how do you determine the best web host for your website? That's the topic for this video. It identifies 5 important things to consider when choosing a web host. The first consideration is the project's requirements. The more complex your website, the greater the demand on your web host. While the technical requirements for a website can be vast, there are 4 general software components to powering a website. The first component is the ability to host static files. The Hello World tutorial from the first web video is a perfect example. It is a single HTML file. This is a static file. It doesn't change. Therefore, it's a pretty straightforward file for a web host to host. There are other types of files that can fit into this category, such as images, PDFs, JavaScript files, and CSS. Files that don't change are generally easier to host, but if your website is dynamic, where a single web page or an entire website can change when it is loaded, then the project requirements are increased. To simplify things, there's an acronym that's common with web hosting. It's called LAMP: Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. The L in LAMP stands for the operating system. Linux may not be a common operating system for desktop users, but it's quite common for web hosting. The letter A in LAMP stands for Apache, which is the HTTP server software. The Apache website boasts that it is the #1 HTTP server on the internet, and that Apache is the most popular web server on the internet since April 1996. If all you were doing was hosting static files, you wouldn't need the next 2 letters in LAMP. So let's focus on that last letter first, which is short for PHP. The PHP.net website states that PHP is a general-purpose scripting language that is especially suited to web development. It's typically associated with content management systems like WordPress. PHP is used to build things like blogs, forums, contact forms, and other such dynamic content. PHP is very common on web servers, but it rarely works alone. That's the 3rd letter in LAMP. The M stands for MySQL. Determining if your website needs a database is a huge factor. If you want to run WordPress, then you'll need a database. It's a requirement. Remember, this is all part of the first consideration, the project requirements. If you're confused by all the acronyms, think of it more generally. The web server needs an operating system to run software. Then it needs software to host files. If dynamic features are required, it needs a programming language and typically a database. The reason to think more generally is because the components can change. There are other choices for the operating system, web server software, programming language, and even the database. LAMP is mentioned because it is very common, and it's what I like to use. The project requirements determine the software and hardware needed to run the website. People may ask for web features, but they may not think of the implications. Imagine if you ran a pizzeria and you wanted a website. Such a project could be very simple, basically a phone number and a menu. But if you wanted to add online ordering, and not through a third-party service, that could get very complicated and very expensive. That leads to the second consideration, the cost. Having a popular website is important, but fame on the internet can be a huge financial drain. There's a reason this video is on YouTube. With one 4K video file being several gigs large, affordable web hosting might not be up to the challenge of running Photics TV. 2 very bad things can happen when you hit the limits of your web host. They can either shut you down or charge you huge fees. That's why it's important to look at the costs associated with web hosting. Are there any overage charges for storage, bandwidth, or CPU usage? If it says unlimited, what does that really mean? This is not to paint web hosts as the bad guys, because it is expensive to manage a website. In the early days of the internet, there was a webmaster that was expected to do it all. Today, the internet is far more specialized. So, if you're building a website, respect the system admins. I'm not saying tolerate bad attitudes, but don't assume that it's just plugging boxes into the wall. This leads to the third consideration, security and maintenance. Websites are the front line of a modern battlefield. I'm not kidding. If you have a popular website online, expect it to be attacked constantly, all day, every day. Spammers, hackers, hostile governments, they're all looking for weaknesses in websites. It's such a strange thing too. If you saw a guy walking down the street, checking all the door handles on the cars, seeking to find one unlocked, you'd probably call the cops. But with running a website, many admins don't even bother blocking the IP addresses. There's just too many. I don't know the best way to handle this problem, but know that it is a problem. That's why security and maintenance is an important consideration with running a website. As an example, if you're running WordPress, is your web host responsible for keeping it updated? If not, you might want to familiarize yourself with a site health page. This is a great new feature of WordPress, as it checks your WordPress website for potential issues. Are your plugins up to date? Are you running a secure and current version of PHP? Is your website using HTTPS? These are important security issues to identify. The easiest content management system to secure is no content management system. But if you simply require features like user management, where site editors can log into the website to update it, then it's important to ensure that your web host and your website are up to that challenge. That leads to the fourth consideration, extra features. Today's websites have higher demands. They're expected to be more than brochures for a business. They're expected to have additional functionality. When choosing a web host, it's important to consider other aspects of having a website. As an example, do you need email? Do you need web analytics? Who's backing up the website? How are the files transferred to the website? Is it just FTP? Are you pushing the code with Git? Or is there something easier, such as a web-based interface? As a silly comparison, I used to play a game called Freelancer. I wanted to host my own web server, but that software was designed for Windows. The home for Photics.com could have hinged on software that has long since been retired, software that had nothing to do with running a website. Part of that decision is related to the fifth consideration, knowing your audience. Not that many people were playing Freelancer, so it wasn't a project that I pursued. It worked out. Tough decisions related to web hosting have to align with the needs of your website visitors. Going back to the pizzeria example, the location of the web host is important. Let's say that the pizza place is in Brooklyn and the servers are in upstate New York. That's pretty close. But if that's an Australian pizza shop, New York is not the ideal location for the website. It's not just server latency to consider. While quick response times are important, that's also true for customer support. Is the overnight shift as responsible as the daytime shift? Is there an overnight shift? Is there customer support at all? Getting support for your website, as problems do arise, is critical in choosing a web host. Anyway, knowing your audience is important in choosing a web host. If your website is big enough and has visitors from all around the world, you might need to host your website from multiple locations. At the very least, how will your website react to a massive traffic surge? In other words, can your website handle popularity? Another audience consideration is interaction. Are you planning to have a forum, a chat room, video conferencing, or some other web-based communication with your website visitors? If so, that could limit your options with web hosting. However, it's important to know that particular features can be hosted through third parties. Just as video can be hosted by YouTube or Vimeo, forums can be powered by Discourse. There are many other examples. But unfortunately, that just expands the hosting problem, as you'd have to choose the third party, and then you'd have to pick the pricing plan. As you get better at making and running websites, you'll likely be able to spot web technology in the wild. Tumult is a great example of this. Their main website appears to be static HTML, but their blog is powered by WordPress, and their forum is powered by Discourse. That's what makes running a website interesting. There can be more than one solution to a problem. The better you can identify how your website fits into those 5 categories, the better you can determine where to host your website. So, to recap, here are the 5 considerations again. First, you have to know your project requirements. The more complex your website, the greater the demand on hosting. Watch out for feature creep too. A project could start out simple, but then turn into a complicated mess. Second, consider the budget. Hosting a website can be very expensive. What's the cost of running the website? Advanced features are nice, but do they justify the higher price tag? This leads to the third consideration. It's not enough to just launch a website, as there are security and maintenance issues. That can also be a big expense. The fourth consideration is related to website features. If you're starting a new website, are you going to have an email address associated with that domain name? And do you want pretty charts showing the traffic to your website? And just to expand a bit on the fourth consideration, hand-holding could be part of the web hosting experience. Is the web host building your website? Or are they providing tools to easily create a website? That's why a lot of websites end up at Wix, Squarespace, or WordPress.com. The fifth consideration is knowing your audience. Websites are built for other people to see. Is your website going to be useful to them? How exactly? And how does the web host fit into that plan? That's a big consideration. These are not the only 5 considerations, though. It depends on your web project and your personal preferences. But in general, this is a good place to start.